The grand ballroom was alive with chatter and clinking glasses. The elite of the business world gathered for a high-profile summit. Conversations about the latest deals, market strategies, and upcoming investments filled the air, while waiters weaved between the guests, balancing trays of expensive champagne. The lavish setting with its crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors reflected the wealth and power of everyone present. In the corner of the room, standing by a quiet section of the bar, Ibrahim Traoré caught the attention of a few passers-by. But for the most part, he blended into the background. His clothes were modest compared to the designer suits that surrounded him. A simple but well-fitted jacket and trousers that, while clean, were nowhere near the extravagance of the other attendees. He wasn't making small talk with any of the moguls or CEOs, nor was he sipping from an expensive glass of wine. Instead, he was engaged in a calm conversation with one of the waiters, his hands resting casually on the counter as he asked questions about the event, offering a warm smile every time the waiter responded. It wasn't long before the chatter around the room shifted. Elon Musk and Donald Trump, two of the most powerful men in the world, were deep in conversation about the future of tech and business. As they laughed and exchanged stories, Trump noticed something out of place. A man in modest clothing standing at the bar, speaking with one of the waiters. The contrast between Ibrahim's simple appearance and the extravagant surroundings caught Trump's eye. "Well, look at this," Trump remarked with a smirk, nudging Elon's arm. "What's this guy doing here? Doesn't exactly fit the bill for a crowd like this, does he?" Elon, always quick to follow Trump's lead, glanced over. He raised an eyebrow, taking in the sight of Ibrahim, who was now leaning in to listen as the waiter explained something. "It doesn't look like he belongs here," Elon added with a chuckle. "Maybe he's lost." Trump's laugh was loud, and several people around them turned their heads, hearing the comment. He wasn't one to hold back his thoughts, especially when he saw an opportunity for a jab. As he and Elon walked toward the bar, their voices louder than usual, they made a beeline for Ibrahim. "Hey there," Trump called out, a wide grin on his face as he approached Ibrahim, who didn't seem to notice them coming. "What's a guy like you doing at an event like this? This isn't exactly a place for, regular folks." Ibrahim turned slowly, meeting Trump's gaze with a calm but direct look, his posture unshaken by the mockery. His response was quiet but firm. "I'm here to participate, Mr. Trump, just like anyone else." Elon, never one to miss a moment for mockery, couldn't resist chiming in. "You must have mistaken the invitation, my friend," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is a gathering of the most successful people on the planet, not a place for, well, someone like you." The bar grew quieter as people began to overhear the exchange. Ibrahim didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a small smile, a subtle confidence emanating from him. "I think you'll find, Mr. Musk, success doesn't always wear a suit." Trump's face hardened slightly, his smirk fading into a look of amusement. He had no interest in letting a moment like this slip by. "Suit or no suit," he said with a dismissive wave, "it's all about who you know, not who you are. Do you even know anyone here?" Ibrahim's eyes locked with Trump's, steady and unyielding. "I don't need to know anyone," he replied, his voice calm but with an edge. "I'm here because I belong. That's more than I can say for some people." The crowd around them shifted, some people still watching the encounter, others too engrossed in their own conversations. Elon looked at Trump, his smirk widening. Well, it seems like you've got a mouth on you," he said to Ibrahim, his voice mocking. "But in a place like this, it's not your words that matter. It's your power, your connections. And I don't think you have either." But Ibrahim didn't back down. He met Elon's gaze with unwavering composure. "And yet, here I am," he said softly. Trump let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "I admire your confidence, but confidence doesn't pay the bills. You'll find that out soon enough. These people, they're not interested in your ideas. They're interested in what you bring to the table." Ibrahim stood in silence for a moment, then replied, "And you're right. It's about what you bring to the table. But sometimes, it's the people you least expect who have something that can change the world." As the words left his mouth, a ripple of quiet surprise spread through the crowd, as if the energy in the room had shifted. The room felt heavy with the tension of the ongoing exchange. Trump and Elon stood there, basking in their self-assuredness, while Ibrahim remained composed, his gaze steady and unwavering. He knew better than to get caught up in petty mockery, but he couldn't help but notice the way Elon treated the waiter who had been serving them earlier. The young waiter, a nervous man in his 20s, approached Elon with a drink refill. His hands trembled slightly as he held the tray, eyes downcast. Elon didn't seem to notice or didn't care, as he took the glass from the waiter with an impatient swipe. The drink splashed over the edge, spilling slightly onto the tray, but Elon didn't acknowledge the mistake. "You call this a refill?" Elon snapped, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. "It's about time you get your act together. Can't even bring a simple drink without spilling it. Unbelievable." The waiter stiffened, his face reddening with embarrassment, but he remained silent, trying not to show how deeply the comment cut. Elon's smirk grew, clearly enjoying the power he held in the moment. "I don't have all day. Maybe you should try being useful for once." The waiter nodded quickly, mumbling a quiet apology as he started to walk away, his steps hesitant. Ibrahim, who had been observing the scene from the side, felt the familiar surge of indignation. He had seen this kind of treatment too many times before, the entitled rich abusing their positions without a second thought. Something inside him snapped, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he stood up. He walked towards Elon and Trump, his eyes fixed on Elon's back, where the billionaire was still laughing at his own remarks. As Ibrahim neared them, he caught the attention of a few bystanders, their curiosity piqued by his sudden movement. Ibrahim was not a man to back down from injustice, not when he saw it, not when he felt it. He stepped right up to Elon, who hadn't noticed him approach. "You've made your point," Ibrahim said, his voice firm but not raised. "But you missed something important." Elon turned, his eyebrow arched in mock curiosity. "What's that?" he asked, clearly unimpressed by Ibrahim's sudden assertiveness. "That it's not about who can shout the loudest or who's wearing the most expensive suit," Ibrahim said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "It's about how you treat others. That waiter didn't deserve your cruelty. He's just doing his job." Elon scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, please, it's just a drink. He'll get over it." "No, he won't," Ibrahim said, his voice growing more resolute. "Words have weight. Actions have consequences. You can't just use people as your punching bags because you think you're untouchable." The crowd that had gathered around them shifted uncomfortably. Even Trump, who had been enjoying the show, seemed to sense that the situation was changing. Some of the guests at nearby tables, who had been too absorbed in their own conversations, now began to listen intently. They hadn't expected anyone, let alone a man like Ibrahim, to stand up to Elon Musk. "You have no idea what it's like to work hard for a living," Elon sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're just a nobody." Ibrahim's eyes didn't waver. He was calm, his composure a stark contrast to Elon's increasingly agitated tone. "No, I don't work for a billionaire like you," he said softly. "But I work hard, and I work to make sure people like him," he pointed at the waiter, who was still standing at the edge of the room, "are treated with dignity, not ridicule." A beat of silence passed. Elon's expression faltered, his arrogance faltering for the first time in the conversation. Ibrahim's words had hit him in a place he didn't like to acknowledge: his privilege. The waiter, who had been standing with his head bowed, now slowly raised his eyes, unsure of what would happen next. Ibrahim turned to him and gave him a small nod of reassurance. "You're doing fine," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The waiter seemed to breathe a little easier, his shoulders relaxing as he gave Ibrahim a grateful, albeit shy smile. Trump, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stood up straighter, trying to reassert control over the conversation. "All right, enough of this," he said with a forced chuckle, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were going. "Let's get back to business, shall we?" But Ibrahim wasn't done. He looked Elon straight in the eye. "Maybe you should think about the way you treat people, Elon. Just because you can't see the value in someone doesn't mean they have none." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Elon's face flushed, and the smirk on his lips finally faded. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Before he could say anything, Ibrahim turned away, walking calmly back toward his seat. The energy in the room had shifted. The power dynamics had changed. People were no longer watching the two billionaires with adoration or awe. They were now watching, waiting to see how Elon would react. But Elon said nothing more. He couldn't. Not in the face of such undeniable truth. As Ibrahim walked back to his table, the murmurs in the room grew louder. At first, they were just whispers, the kind of hushed conversations that people have when they're unsure of what they've just witnessed. But then, as the tension lingered in the air, the whispers began to grow in intensity. "I don't think that guy's just some random person," one of the guests at a nearby table murmured, glancing at Ibrahim's retreating figure. "Did you hear the way he spoke? It wasn't just a lecture. It felt like a command." Another guest nodded. "He had a presence about him." Like he's not just here to make small talk. Elon Musk, meanwhile, stood frozen, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and frustration. He hadn't expected to be challenged, not by someone like Ibrahim. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't in control of the room, and as the conversation continued to swirl around him, more and more people started to take note of Ibrahim. One man, dressed in a dark suit, leaned toward his companion and whispered, "I'm telling you, that guy, he looks familiar. I swear I've seen him on TV." "I think you're right," his companion said, squinting toward Ibrahim. "Isn't he the president of Burkina Faso?" The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The realization spread like wildfire. People looked at each other in disbelief, then turned their gazes back to Ibrahim, who was sitting calmly at his table, not a care in the world. Elon, still trying to recover from the public scolding, heard the name president whispered through the crowd. He turned quickly, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had no idea who Ibrahim was, but now it was becoming clear. The man he'd mocked so easily was a world leader, a figure of great power and influence. Ibrahim sat back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He was still composed, still unflinching. As the realization spread throughout the room, it was as though everyone had just woken up from a long sleep, suddenly aware of the truth they had overlooked. "Wait a minute," one woman spoke up, her voice a little louder now. "Ibrahim Traoré is the president of Burkina Faso? Are you kidding me? The man you just mocked is one of the most powerful leaders in Africa?" The shock spread like wildfire. There were gasps, murmurs, and then silence, as people began to realize just how big of a mistake Elon had made. It wasn't just that Ibrahim was powerful. It was that he had been so humble, so unassuming in the face of all the wealth and privilege surrounding him. Someone else spoke up, their voice shaking with excitement. "Ibrahim Traoré is one of the most respected leaders in the world right now. How could Elon have been so blind?" It was at that moment that a more authoritative voice entered the fray. One of the older businessmen who had been watching from the corner of the room cleared his throat and stood up. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, addressing Elon directly. "Ibrahim isn't just a president. He's a leader who's earned his place. And here you are, mocking him as if he's some lowly servant. You've just made a fool of yourself." The businessman paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. The crowd, which had been divided in its loyalty to Elon just moments ago, was now turning against him. A few more people chimed in, nodding in agreement. "I think we all know who the real nobody is here," one man said, his voice loud and clear. "It's not Ibrahim Traoré, that's for sure." Elon's smugness had disappeared. His face was pale, his confidence shattered by the realization of who he had just mocked. He had expected the room to be on his side. After all, he was Elon Musk. But now, all eyes were on him, waiting for his reaction. I didn't know," Elon stammered, trying to backtrack, his arrogance suddenly replaced by unease. "I thought he was just some random guy." Ibrahim's eyes met Elon's for a brief moment, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence was more powerful than any words could have been. The room had shifted. People who had once looked up to Elon now watched him with a mixture of disappointment and judgment. They had seen the truth in Ibrahim's words, and they could no longer ignore it. The powerful man in modest clothing had just turned the tables on the billionaire in front of a crowd that was now firmly in his corner. But it didn't stop there. The businessman who had spoken up earlier walked over to Ibrahim's table. "Mr. Traoré," he said, addressing Ibrahim with respect, "if there's one thing we've learned today, it's that real power doesn't need to flaunt itself. Your leadership, your wisdom, it speaks volumes." Ibrahim nodded, a small appreciative smile crossing his face. "Thank you," he said simply. His tone was calm, but there was a quiet authority in it that no one could deny. The entire room had witnessed something remarkable. It wasn't just that Ibrahim had stood up to Elon Musk, it was that he had done so with dignity, with grace, and with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were. And in doing so, he had exposed the true weakness in Elon's arrogance. The tables had turned. The crowd that had once adored Elon now saw him for what he was, a man who had underestimated the power of humility. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood. Sometimes it's the ones who are least expecting to be noticed, who end up commanding the most respect. Elon had been outclassed, not by wealth, but by the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to prove. And the irony was not lost on anyone. As the tension in the room began to settle, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. Elon stood, visibly trying to regain some of the confidence he had lost in front of the room. He straightened his jacket, attempting to appear composed, but the damage was done. People who had once looked up to him now exchanged glances, their eyes filled with judgment. Elon, who had been used to controlling every room he entered, now found himself in an unfamiliar position. The respect that he had once demanded was no longer his. The weight of his own arrogance had shifted, and the silence that followed felt like 1,000 unspoken words. Ibrahim remained seated, his posture still composed as ever. It wasn't his style to gloat, but there was something in the air now that spoke volumes. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His silence was more powerful than any speech or retort. The older businessman who had stood up earlier continued to speak, his voice carrying across the room. "Let's not forget," he said, looking at Elon with disdain. "This is the kind of leader we need in this world. Not one who hides behind wealth and fame, but one who leads by example." Elon shifted his weight uncomfortably as the room began to buzz with murmurs of agreement. The truth was, in that moment, no one cared about Elon's net worth or his reputation in Silicon Valley. What mattered was integrity, humility, and the ability to listen, qualities that Ibrahim had demonstrated without uttering a single boastful word. Ibrahim's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy that had once defined Elon's life. And while Elon struggled to recover his pride, Ibrahim had already won something far more valuable: the respect of the room. As the conversation continued, the mood slowly began to shift. People who had once been hesitant, uncertain about Ibrahim's role in the world, now looked at him differently. There was no denying it. He had shown them a side of leadership they hadn't expected. It wasn't just the fact that Ibrahim had stood his ground. It was how he had done it, with humility, with restraint, and with an unshakable sense of self that no amount of wealth or fame could overshadow. Elon, for all his bravado, had failed to understand that. He had underestimated Ibrahim, and in doing so, had made a mockery of himself in front of an audience that was now watching him carefully, waiting to see how he would react. "That maybe you should think about that next time, Musk," the businessman added, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to close the conversation. "It's not about who you know or how much money you have. It's about who you are and how you treat people." And with that, the last traces of Elon's confidence slipped away. The room, once divided, was now united in its quiet respect for Ibrahim. The shift had occurred, not with a grand speech, but with a simple act of standing up for what was right. Ibrahim, sensing that the moment had passed, stood up from his seat, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "It's time for me to go," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of someone who had just left a lasting impression. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his departure as graceful as his entrance. As the door closed behind him, the room remained silent for a long moment, the air still heavy with the tension of what had just unfolded. It wasn't the confrontation that had mattered, but the way Ibrahim had carried himself, with dignity, respect, and the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. Elon stood, still processing everything that had just happened. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't in control. The realization stung, but the room's new energy was undeniable. No one was talking about Elon Musk anymore. They were talking about Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had changed everything with a single quiet confrontation. As the event came to a close, people filed out, their conversations buzzing with excitement. Ibrahim's legacy had grown that night, and it wasn't because of his title or his wealth. It was because he had stood up for what was right, in a room filled with the richest and most powerful people in the world, and had earned their respect without saying a single word about himself. And that, as it turned out, was more powerful than any of the material wealth that had once defined Elon Musk's world.